It's not our fault. We try to stay on top of this as best as we can. So, so when you go onto social media, I know everybody's on Facebook and they're on the SUAS Commercial Pilots, Facebook page, and they're looking at everything on social media. We ask that you just close your computer with respect to that and reach out to experts in the field actually and talk to them and find out what's going on. So the social media is really confusing because some people have old information and they're not up to date. Or they just kind of are rogue operators and they really don't care. So make sure that you're reaching out to professionals and people who actually understand what's going on and will tell you the actual rules and regulations. So.
All right, so with all that prefatory information, our presentation is kind of in two parts because really you think about drones and local government, we kind of wear two hats. One is the operator of a drone. Your police, fire, your PEG station, as many of you are here for that, all may want to use drones for various uses. But also, many of your cities are thinking about how do we regulate drones? So what do we do about the guy who's buzzing City Hall with a drone? And so we're going to kind of talk about our presentation within those two parts, starting out with operations and then moving after that to regulations. And when we think about these two hats, some of the different things that you may be concerned with. As I said, fire and police, obviously their disaster response, especially with the hurricanes recently, huge application there. Temporary cell sites is one that's really been interesting with the hurricanes. Verizon and other companies have been using drones as temporary cell towers by tethering them to the ground via an electrical cord. Really neat stuff. Code enforcement, resource management. I had a client who used a drone to do forestry studies using LiDAR. Really neat stuff there. Utilities, line inspections, cell tower antenna inspections, all readily achievable with the drone at cheaper and safer than you would with a manned aviation or a guy in a bucket truck. So really changing every aspect of government you can think of. There's a drone application out there somewhere. On the other side of the house, regulatory. I said, the biggest one is probably privacy and the guy who's being too aggressive with a drone. But also all sorts of regulatory information that you may be concerned with about what you do with drone data, searches, warrants with drones, all that kind of stuff is stuff that cities are just now beginning to understand and think about, and something we kind of want to talk about in this presentation.
Oh, and at the end of this presentation, we could talk about this for 2 days. So yep. Just know that we're going to kind of shotgun this for y'all. So.
Okay, starting out, we're going to do local government as operators, which I know many of you are here to learn about. So when you think about the regulatory framework for drones, it really depends on what is the intent of the flight. If you're a model hobbyist and your intent is for a hobby purpose, you are a model aircraft and you're generally unregulated. If you are flying with a commercial purpose, and we'll kind of get into the details of what that means, is that it's really important. And you're flying on the commercial intent, you are a commercial drone, and you're subject to Part 107, which we're going to talk about, or other FAA authorizations like Section 333. And if you're a government drone, you're flying for a government function, and once again, that term is very important because the FAA defines it in a very specific way. You are a government drone, and you can fly under what's called a public code that we'll talk about, or another FAA authorization like Part 107 or Section 333. And what's really important as we start to march through this regulatory framework, and you need to understand, is that the same drone can be all three. The PEG guy in your office could have a hobby drone that he flies for hobby purposes, but he also brings it to work and flies it for PEG purposes. At that point, that drone transfers from being a hobby drone to a commercial drone. And then, the police may call him up and say, we really need your drone on a police mission. That drone is now a government drone. And that same drone can be all three and is operating under three different regulatory frameworks. That's something I think is really important to understand, that it's not the aircraft that matters, it's the intent of the flight.
Yeah, and if you are, like I said, if you have your drone at home and somebody goes, hey, let's use this for PEG programming, and you bring it in, you need to make sure for insurance purposes who owns that aircraft at that time. So there are leasing agreements, there's regulatory framework on that as well. Just lease it for $1 for 90 days. And one of the things you have to make sure from an insurance point of view is you have to understand who actually owns that drone during that operation. Right. And it has to be clearly defined.
we're going to start with Part 107, which is a new, relatively new law, came out last year by the FAA, and it's kind of what we call the bread and butter of drone law. It covers most of your drone applications. So it said last year FAA comes out with it. It requires commercial operators of drones, and commercial is very specifically defined to get licensed with the FAA as a remote pilot in command. It's not your typical pilot's license. It's a new separate category they created, and we're going to talk later about a test you have to take in order to be certified as remote pilot in command. And so it requires commercial UAS to be registered. The drone has to be registered with the FAA. And then when I say commercial, it's anything that could serve as a commercial purpose. So just because government is doing it doesn't mean necessarily that it's not commercial. If it's a proprietary function of government, if it's a PEG station, if it's real estate management, if it's anything that's not a core government function, and think about core government function, it's life, safety, public health, right? If it's not a core public function, it is a commercial drone. It needs to be registered under Part 107, and you need to have a pilot who's registered as a remote pilot in command in charge of that flight under 107, or have another type of FAA authorization called Section 333 exemption process, which is being phased out. So we're not going to spend any time on it, but really Part 107, if you're starting from the grounds up, is really what you need to look at for most of your drone activity.
So real quick, all public entities, their aircraft have to be registered. So even your fire department, their aircraft have to be registered as well. The only entities that currently don't have to have their unmanned aircraft registered at this time are hobbyists. And I say at this time because that is subject to change,
Right.
kind of any day. You
And
never
we'll
know.
talk more about that one too.
Oh, so another quick thing. So we're gonna talk about the difference between operating under Part 107, which is kind of what we consider kind of more of the civil side of operating unmanned aircraft, and then we're gonna talk about the public side and being able to operate under what's called a public certificate of authorization. The FAA eventually wants everybody operating under this. This is their goal. So if you're looking at setting up a program, you might as well just set it up under this. Is one of the things that we kind of recommend is looking at this to begin with. And using this as your regulatory framework. Operate under a public COA later on, as we're going to talk about, but really keep this in mind and use this as the guidance. That's what we use. We use 107 as a guidance because the FAA eventually hopes that everybody's operating under this. All right, so by the numbers, this is a pretty busy slide, but one of the things as public regulators and as personnel in this industry, you have to understand is what's actually happening at the grassroots. So a couple of these numbers are about a year old. The FAA expected commercial operations to increase from 42,000 at the end of 2016 to about 442,000 aircraft by 2021, with the potential to quadruple that amount to 1.6 million. Those are some really big numbers. So over 50,000 commercial registrations and 664 hobby registrations happened last year. 5,600 commercial, 400,000 for hobby. So a year ago, there were 520,000 registered drone operators in the U.S. There are only 320,000 registered manned aircraft. So the unmanned aircraft side of the house is doubling and is going to triple, and it's just going to take over the manned side of the house. There are going to be so many more unmanned aircraft operators than there are manned operators, simply because the barrier to entry, which is that financial cost, and the schooling is so low. So this is allowing this technology to get into the hands of people who would normally not be able to have access to this.
It's important to, that numbers are important to you as a government because you get you're part of regulating all those new people who are coming into this space that are not, traditionally pilots, although they are coming to that side of the house now. You need to be regulating them, and also as you as an operator have to be aware of all these other users of the airspace. Just want to kind of, show you what's happening out there with 107. It's the registration has been phenomenally high.
Yeah. And so if you look at, there's this company called DJI. I know a lot of people have heard about them in the news recently. So they were at one point in time shipping 12,000 UAVs a month, and that was a year ago, 12,000 a month. And the people who are operating these are the people in your cities. So you're looking at 1.6 million people operating these in your cities.
So back to 107. Public operators, such as all of you mostly, can operate under these 107 regulations as we talk about, or a public certificate of authorization depending on the purpose of the flight. or a Section 333 exemption potentially. But as Chrissy said, most needs of your city can be met by 107, and the FAA is trying to move everybody towards that regulation anyways. So we encourage you to look at 107. But you can operate in both. We're going to talk about a case study later of a city of Dubuque, Iowa that does operate under both. And so that's definitely an option out there. Most of this will not apply to you, but if you have an existing FAA authorization prior to 2016, you can continue operating under that authorization under the Section 333 exemption process. But when that runs out, you got to renew under 107. Something to keep in mind for the very limited number of people that are out there. But for a whole bunch of reasons we don't really have time to get into, you probably shouldn't be operating under Section 333 anyways. That 107 is a much better fit for your organization.
So public operators. So this is where 49 U.S. Code 40102 and 40125. Those are the two codes that kind of spell out exactly what a public operation is. And so if you can meet the definition of 40102 and 40125, then you can fall into this sort of category right here, right? And the key is it has to be a core government function. A lot of people go back and forth. Right now we say a core government function is not PEG. I do know lawyers who have said that PEG is a core government function. So until we have case law or somebody challenges it, this is probably going to be more or less either up to your legal team, your attorney general, your attorneys generals. It's going to be right there. And so, we talk about social media and people say, oh, you can, oh, you can't. This is one of the things, because this is so new, that we don't have a lot of case law with this, so we're kind of winging it. And I hate to say that, especially when you're talking about legal framework. Some of the stuff we are winging simply because nobody has come out with a true definition of some of this, and a lot of organizations and a lot of legal teams don't want to touch it right now.
Right, and
they're waiting for the FAA, and the FAA is not doing anything.
And the safest option, from our perspective, from Kissinger and Feldman's perspective, would is stick with a 107. We don't believe that PEG is a core government function. If you look at the whole body of U.S. case law, when it defines what a core government function is, and not necessarily within the FAA context, but within other contexts, it's really life safety, public health. Unless you're flying your drone for one of those purposes, it's probably not a core government function. And quite honestly, from a business and perspective, 107 is going to better meet your needs. It's easier to administer, a lot less restrictions. That's probably what you should be looking at doing anyways. So now we're going to have a little pop quiz. I realize it's a lot of information, but kind of hammer down, these issues. So does your PEG drone have to comply with 107? We have people all the time who's like, oh, I can just fly. It's just for fun. We use the video here and there. What do you think? Do you have to have a government authorization?
I'm not getting paid for it. I hear that a lot.
Yeah, I'm not getting paid for it.
I'm not getting paid for it.
Yeah, it's me, my public service, right, to the city. Does my PEG drone have to be authorized? Yes. Definitely get authorization. Don't try to go out there on your own and do your own thing. You do not, and you'll see later when I get on the wrong side of the FAA. Get that 107 authorization, or if you have a Section 333. Any flight with a commercial intent, and it's not just because government's doing doesn't mean it's not commercial. It's a proprietary piece of government. If it's any sort of proprietary thing, it's a commercial flight. It needs to have FAA authorization. So bonus question: can a PEG drone operate under public COA? Another one. It's like, well, police and fire are authorizing or doing flights under public COA. Why can't we just use that? No, as I explained, in our opinion at least, it's not a core government function. You should not be using your police and fire department's core government function authorization to fly your PEG drone. You should have a separate authorization.
So bonus question 2. Can the same drone serve PEG under Part 107 and police under a public COA? Yeah, we talked about that earlier, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Oh, wait, and then, wow.
We already talked about that. Go ahead,
there
though.
you go. So, yes. Absolutely. And so that kind of helps out your department if you're on a financial constraint of having one drone. But the dilemma is if PEG is using the drone and there's a fire, and now your fire department needs access to that drone, now they don't have access to that drone. So we kind of don't recommend doing that. Unfortunately, these drones are cheap enough that you could probably have two. There's really no reason for that. And that's one of the reasons later on when we go into the case study why Dubuque, Iowa chose to do what they did.
We have clients that use the same drone for multiple departments. It can be done, but there's operational constraints to that. So maybe a little So yeah, once again, really hammer this down. The regulatory framework that you're working under depends on the intent of the flight. It doesn't matter who bought the drone, who's flying the drone. It's the intent of the flight, and that depends on what you're intending that flight to be for. Depends on what regulatory framework you're going to fall under. We've talked about. All right, so some of the people, and I've done this in the past in the presentation, like, well, what about this? I heard there's a court decision on Facebook that says that none of this stuff matters anymore, right? That I can go out and fly my drone and do anything I want, and the FAA can't touch me because this court decision allegedly came out that struck all this down. And the court decision that they're talking about is Taylor versus Huerta. And what this was about was the registration requirement for hobby drones. You may remember that back beginning of this year, the FAA put a requirement that required all hobbyists, if their drone weighed more than a half pound, essentially, to register that drone with the FAA, to put on tail numbers, so on and so forth. Some hobbyists did not like that, as you might imagine. It was only $5, but they thought it was an invasion of privacy.
It was actually free. The
Oh, it's
first
free?
60 days, it was free.
The first 60 days is $5 after that,
And then
right?
it was $5.
Yeah. It was free, then $5. It wasn't a lot of money. They gave you a tail number you got to print off and put in your drone. I think that was kind of cool. I used to do model aviation, and I always put fake tail numbers on all my planes. So I don't know. I don't know why that was such a big deal. But anyways, a couple of guys got together. And I actually read a story about how they did it. It was two guys in a bar basically drafted a complaint, together. One attorney, one modelist. And they filed it, and it turns out the court sided with them and said the FAA does not have this authority, that model aircraft do not fall within this power of registration for the FAA, and basically enjoined the FAA from requiring registrations. So if you're a hobbyist, good for you. You don't have to register your drone anymore, but this is just for hobby drones. It has nothing to do with commercial drones, for public drones, just hobby drones. So don't use this as an excuse to go out and film something you're not supposed to without authorization.
So we can get back to that. You have your drone that you use, at home, right? Your drone at home, and then you go into PEG and you're using it to fly for PEG. Well, that drone has to be registered when you fly it for the PEG function. So then you have to decide if you're going to take that tail number off every time you then go home and put your tail number on. So it just gets really confusing. You really have to make sure that you're balancing all of that. And you understand each time you fly what rules and regulations you fall under and what you have to do. So don't take that tail number off and then go and fly for PEG and forget to put that tail number on, because now you're in violation.
So the next thing, we'll get to the next slide. People tell us, the 107 test is a multiple choice test. I heard it's not that hard. It has a 90% pass rate. I'm just going to go wing it, right? And Chris will ask you, she's an instructor on part 107. Can you read that?
Yeah, if you can read this, how many people here can read this?
Yeah.
Okay, that's good. But what I find ironic are the people that just raise their hands are not the people that raised their hands earlier that said that they have a drone. I'm not going to call anybody out. I'm just saying, I know who you got. This is being recorded. So
we're shipping it to the FAA after this. So
I'll give you my business card. I'll teach you how to read this. Yeah, so this is where we start. As I go, if you can't read this thing, this is the map of the sky, essentially, right? This is the RAND. I call this the RAND McNally of the sky. It's called a visual flight rules. It's a VFR sectional. It's a 1/250 chart. There's various nicknames for it, but it's the VFR sectional. And this tells aviators, which, by the way, if you're going to fly a drone, welcome to aviation. Welcome to aviation, and be proud of yourself that you are now going to be considered an aviator. But you better know how to read this thing, because this is how we transit the airways. And this is, as a helicopter pilot, this is really the only, if you can read this is really the only thing I care about being on that test. This is the only thing I care about you really, really understanding, is how to stay out of my way when I'm flying, and how to read this and know where I'm at as a helicopter pilot, and where you can go, and where we can share space with one another. So if you can't read this, I recommend you get trained on how to read it.
So in addition to reading that very colorful map, that VR sectional of Phoenix, Arizona, There's a bunch of other stuff you're going to be tested on the Part 107 exam. I'm not going to read through them all, but there's 12 categories of testing. The important one here is that there is no flight testing. So the 107 test is a multiple choice test you take. It doesn't care about whether you can actually fly a drone, it's whether you have the knowledge base to be able to fly a drone. And so just in our best practices later, you not only need to get trained on how to take the 107 test, but you probably want some flight training too, because that's not something that's tested by the FAA.
Yeah, when we send our instructors out, when we teach and we go out to fire departments and PEG operators and anybody we can, and we teach them to fly and teach them to take the Part 107, we make sure that they get hands-on training, because think about being a mayor or being the city councilor or being in charge of a program, right? And it's like taking a driving test. Just because you can go and pass a test doesn't mean that you can come out here into Seattle and actually drive a car. And essentially what the FAA has done is said, hey, if you can pass the test, you can drive the car. And we really frown upon that. It's kind of a sticking point. DOT is looking at it right now. Eventually, there probably will be a hands-on flight portion of this. The head of the DOT UAS made the comment to me. He said, "I'm a Part 107 operator, and I've never even touched a drone." So another thing to think about with this, a lot of entities are hiring this out, all right? A lot of municipalities are hiring this work out from somebody else. And you want to make sure that the people that you are hiring, you want more than just somebody who's passed the test or has owned their drone for a couple of months, got it for Christmas or Mother's Day, right? Got a drone for Mother's Day, and now it's a mom with a drone out there flying for hire, right? And I know that it's funny. I'm telling you, go on Facebook, and that's exactly who people are hiring. That is exactly who municipalities have hired, are people who have no experience on what's going on. And so make sure that you somehow have a vetting system. It's one of the things that we work really hard on making sure is that when municipalities don't understand who to hire, that they have somebody to reach out to and talk to and go, hey, these are their qualifications. This is their demo reel. This is how long they've been flying, and this is what they're doing. And this is really important.
Next misconception, I got my 107 certification. I'm a remote pilot in command. My drone is registered with the FAA. Let's go shoot some sweet video over a concert, right? That's what everybody wants to do, right? Those are the really cool shots. New Jersey, which we were last time we gave this presentation, there was an incident actually over a very big event where people, it's kind of like a polar plunge type thing. They run to the sea. And a drone fell on somebody. I don't think it was any serious, but it was an incident. 107 comes with a lot of different restrictions on what you can do with your drone. Number one, you're basically limited to below 400 feet above ground level. You can't fly to the tip of the sky. That's one restriction. There's some other stuff about that too, but we can talk in more detail offline. No swarming. You can't fly 12 drones all together. If you want to get
Intel and you get away. Or Disney.
Yeah, Disney or Intel, they've done that. And actually, I've seen the Disney show. It's really cool. But they're doing it over water, not over people. There's absolutely almost no chance they're going to impact anybody. You can waive a lot of these things. But you have a lot of very specific ways you mitigate the risks of that activity. You have to file an application to the FAA. It's not easy to get. As I said, there's only been 2 swarming applications or waivers ever approved, Disney and Intel. The one that probably all of you want to do, as most people want to do, is fly over people, right? That's the biggest no-no you can ever do. You cannot fly over people to 107 unless you get a waiver. And there have been many people who have tried to get a waiver. And so far, only one person has got one, and that's CNN.
Yeah, and they're on what's called the Pathfinder program. They had that before Part 107 came out.
Yep.
There's a couple of organizations at the FAA reached out that
Right.
we're working with the FAA to figure out what type of safety management system, what risks are involved with this, so that's actually a study case that's under the Pathfinder program. Now, if you're a public entity, this is different if you're under a public COA. Public COAs now automatically get night operations, and they automatically get ops over people under certain circumstances, depending on the emergency. So that's where we're talking about this 107 versus this public COA. They're different. The 107 is like, oh, you don't have to be flying, but it would be really nice for the government to be able to get this video or for whatever's going on for this. Public COA this is really a life-saving type of thing.
So what happens if I go and do one of these things I'm not supposed to? I go fly over a bunch of people. Well, the FAA is out enforcing these regulations, and you can be punished by the FAA just as any other pilot would be for reckless operations. It's very serious. The fines can be very high. I think I have on there up to $250,000 per incident and imprisonment per incident. And so which means you can rack these up pretty quick. On one flight, you can have 10 incidents, you can have 20 incidents. And it's not just each flight. They can look back and say, you did 60 flights and had 10 incidents each. Here's your bill. And that's actually what happened to a company. It's called Skypan International. You've probably seen their photos before. They make these really cool panoramic shots with drones. Look really, really neat. They got a $1.9 million fine from the FAA for 60 flights that occurred over a period of 2 years. And the reason why it was so high is they got dinged $10,000 here, $25,000 there, because they flew over people, they flew too close to aircraft, they flew too close to buildings, didn't have all the proper authorizations. That's kind of what can happen to you if you don't do things by the book. Extreme case, but just so let you know that's out there, and the FAA is enforcing these regulations.
Yeah, and this is what I say too for your local law enforcement. If you find a rogue operator, you can pay for your whole drone program with just one. I'm just saying, you don't need to do a boot driver spaghetti dinners. You just go and find somebody. Trust me, search the Facebook, they're ratting each other out left and right. You can find someone. So case study, Dubuque, Iowa. This is I really like this because this is exactly what we do and why we're here. And I want to thank Rich. He's really the one who I met. Well, who met me? I don't know. We met one another, and as we all do with Rich. And he had this great idea, and I'd never heard of NATOA. I'd never heard of PEG. You guys are kind of these unsung heroes that are running everything in the background. And he had this great idea. And shortly after Power Partners, a year ago at least, we did an eNATOA with the filming group. And out of that, Dubuque, Iowa, and Craig Nowak was on there. Does anybody know Craig? Out of curiosity. So Craig was on there, and it's taken us almost a year to get here. By the time he's jumped through all of his hoops and he's gotten everybody involved, and please, it doesn't usually take that long. It's just, since it's a new technology, it's taken some people to really get on board. But what he realized was that not only did PEG want to do this, but the fire department was talking about it, the police department was talking about it, everybody was talking about it, and everybody wanted to use PEG's drone, right? Use this one unmanned aircraft, this one DJI Phantom, for all of Dubuque, Iowa. And as we started talking to Craig, they have an airport. We talked to their airport manager. We did an entire program for the city of Dubuque. And so what happens is now your mayor, your city council, they're able to have all of their first responders and their public entities under one program, under one SOP, SOG, whatever you want to call it, one main standard operating procedure. Everybody is trained to the same level. Everybody is trained to the same level. So if your police department happens to work with your fire department, you're talking the same talk. You've all been trained to the same level, to the same standard. You're operating the same way. And the mayor knows that this is what's happening. And so what we did was we wrote an entire program for the city of Dubuque. And then what happens is when we talk about the public COA Part 107, when they fill out their form in the morning, they check off whether or not the operations they're doing that day, if it's a Part 107 operation under their safety risk statement, or if it's a public COA. That way at the end of the day, if something happens and you have to get lawyers involved, they can say, look, we were operating under a public COA, that's why we were authorized to fly over people for this situation. Versus we were operating under a Part 107 and we flew over people and now we're in trouble. So it's really, right? So it's really important. And so we worked really hard with Dubuque. We worked with their, like I said, fire department, police department, their mayor, their airport manager, and we built an entire program out for them. They're getting trained next week actually with an amazing instructor. So they'll be able to read that map. And that's one of the things that we recommend is don't piecemeal this where your mayors and your city councils have all these different programs. Come together. That way, in case there is an emergency, if you have a natural disaster, you can come together and you know that you all know how to work with one another. It's really important.
All right, so after all that fun on the operations side, I'm going to talk about the less fun area of regulations, and I'm sure your city councils, your staff has approached you or other people in your organization about the guy who's buzzing a water tower with a drone, and we want to ban all drones and stuff to that effect. I get those calls all the time.
Has anybody here been approached to write like a local ordinance or help write within the city any
Drone regulations?
Drone regulations. Oh.
All right,
Oh.
we got one. Ken Feldman, my
Ken
boss.
back there. I didn't even notice. Everybody?
Who'd have thought, right? Well, if you haven't, you probably will at some point. I've talked to people at this conference who have been approached by someone within their organization and say, let's write some drone regulations. And usually people start off with this really pie in the sky idea of we're going to ban all drones, which, as we're going to talk about, is not really feasible. And the reason for this is the interaction between the FAA regulations and local regulations, and that preemptory effect of federal regulation. If you have a federal law that conflicts with a state law or a local law, federal law trumps in almost all cases. That's kind of what we're talking about, preemption. And as we march through this, you're going to see that that general peremptory framework we talk about as attorneys is getting a lot more complicated thanks to new regulations, new laws, uncertainty in the federal government. So it's getting harder and harder to do this. But we're going to talk about what we think are some good practices to think about when you've been approached and you're going to write a drone regulation.
I want to say, so because I'm in DC, I know we're gonna do all questions at the end, guys. We're gonna do. I promise.
Yeah.
We'll be here for 2 days. So I'm up in DC, and as much as I hate lobbyists and lobbying and all of that good stuff, the AMA, the modelers, they have a huge voice up there. Okay, they have a huge voice. I'm not going to say it's a whiny voice. I'm going to say it's a huge voice, right? And a lot of this regulation is to protect those modelers, all right? And so we have to decide, as far as who you guys use to, you use to lobby, whether it's League of Cities, whoever it is that you're using, to get up there and get your voice heard. You need to make sure that your voice as the city, right, is heard up here on Capitol Hill, because who's driving this are the lobbyists, all right? And you need to make sure that they're not driving your agenda, and they're not driving what's happening at your city and what's happening in your parks and what's happening in your natural areas and around your buildings and around your amusement parks and your water towers. All right, and you need to make sure at the same time that you're doing that you still allow for the proliferation of this technology to be used for your real estate agents who want to go and take a beautiful picture of your, of a piece of property that they're selling. So it's this balance, but you need to make sure that your voice is being heard up there as well, and that this isn't driving your agenda.
So
I hate to say that.
So with that in mind, all of aviation law up until this law was focused towards manned aviation. The FAA Reauthorization Act, you're going to see later, a lot of this drone policy comes out of the Reauthorization Act process, was the first piece of legislation to address drones at the federal level. Did a number of things in terms of research. Big one on here, civil penalty for interference with law enforcement and firefighting. A lot of people are like, we need a regulation to pass to people interfering with our fire operations for forest fires. Turns out there already is something on the books. The feds have authority to go out and do that. Okay. So it's already on the books. Important thing to keep in mind, report those people to the FAA as they can be fined. The big part here, and it looks like my font actually got taken out, there was a small piece of this legislation that basically allowed for what I'm going to call a no-fly zone application, or that the DOT, Department of Transportation, was supposed to come up with a rulemaking to create this no-fly zone type application, where you'd submit an application to the DOT, they make a determination, and things like critical infrastructure, oil refineries, amusement parks, or other locations that warrant such restrictions, could be City Hall, right, could have a no-fly zone placed over it. Unfortunately, nothing has happened on that, besides from the DoD getting some nice flight restrictions and the ability to take down drones if they need it. But it's something we're going to look at, and it muddies the picture of where does the local government stand in relation to federal government even more.
All right, so scope of local government authority.
And so as we've kind of been talking about, the scope of authority is kind of unclear. But generally, what the FAA has said is that anything that has to do with the operations of drones, safety requirements, training, anything that where they can fly, stuff like that is within their wheelhouse. Where local governments have powers, areas of traditional local control, land use, zoning, kind of those traditional city powers. And as I know, city attorneys, these areas can be very blurred as we're trying to figure out, where can we interact with each other. That's kind of what we're kind of dealing with right now. And as you'll see, things have been done to try to straighten out this very blurry picture. But there is no general preemptory rule in 107 or any other place at this point. So we're really stuck with trying to guess where we can regulate and where the FAA regulates.
So remember I told you before you need to make sure that your agenda is being driven up there. So Administrator Huerta, FAA Administrator, during a Senate hearing said, quote, "I don't have a great deal of clarity in my mind as to what state and local and government entities would desire to regulate." So he doesn't know what you want to regulate, what the cities you want to regulate, what the mayors and what needs to happen. He doesn't know. And so if he doesn't know, all he's doing is listening to ideas. And so you need to make sure that those are your ideas and that you're presenting that to him.
And so on top of this, we have all sorts of regulatory uncertainty in Capitol Hill, some of which we're going to talk about. Interestingly, the drone industry wants more regulations because there's all this uncertainty out there. They kind of need some guidelines about how to operate. The drone advisory, the Commercial Drone Alliance has been heavily lobbying the Trump administration for more regulations. Thanks to Trump's 2-for-1 regulatory pledge, where for every regulation that we come out with, we're going to cut 2. Not okay with the drone industry is they have no regulations. And just recently, they're again on Capitol Hill trying to lobby on June 22nd. So, more regulatory uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen. As you're going to see, there's a lot of legislation on the Hill right now that we don't know what's going to do. So keep going. What's really important to you guys, drone ordinances, what can we do? I'm going to show you a tale of two cities. One we think is a pretty good regulation and one we think is a really bad regulation. And I apologize to anyone in the crowd who it's your regulation. But this is my personal opinion. I consult your city attorney, so on and so forth. But we're going to walk through this why we think each one's good. Orlando, Florida, actually my hometown, recently passed a drone ordinance. This one really gets into the heart of what the FAA thinks is their area of regulatory concern, which is flight operations. It includes all sorts of restrictions that are more stringent than what's in 107. These things include permit requirements, civil and criminal penalties that go way beyond what the federal government allows, all sorts of flight restrictions. I think there's even training and safety requirements, which the FAA has clearly stated is their area of concern. We think if this one were to get challenged, it would be likely preempted. We can get you a copy of that Orlando ordinance if you want to look. But it goes beyond what the federal government has mandated. And if anytime you're going beyond the federal government, you're usually in a place of concern because the federal government doesn't like it when cities are doing more than they are.
So real quick, another thing about this is Florida government, the Florida governor just passed a law, a bill, and it provides that the authority to regulate the ownership or operation of unmanned aircraft systems is vested in the state. So when we talk about the law today versus the law tomorrow, what we say today might not be true tomorrow. In Florida, even though we have this going on, the Florida governor then passed a bill that said, state and local municipalities, you have no teeth. But you don't get to regulate. But you can come to me maybe and we'll help you regulate. But in the meantime, it's going to be held at the state level.
But the cities are challenging that law. So not only is the federal government and the local governments fighting each other, the state and the locals are fighting each other, the state and the federal government are fighting each other. It's an uncertain area. So I want to contrast our Orlando ordinance with the San Diego ordinance. And really important here, San Diego went to the FAA and said, please help us draft a drone ordinance. We're having all these issues. We really need some help here. And good on the FAA, they said, okay, we can help. And they sat down and jointly drafted an ordinance that to deal with the drone issues in their city. And what's really important here is that what that drone ordinance does is it allows a local enforcement mechanism for the federal rules that are already on the books. So you don't have to create all the the guidelines, the training requirements. You're just enforcing what the feds have already said is okay, which is really, from our perspective, is the right way to do it in this climate of regulatory uncertainty, because the FAA has blessed this type of approach. The American Model Association, which is very powerful, as Chrissy said, nice to be a former member, don't have it anymore. But, they blessed this approach as well and said, we can live with this. And we think if, this was challenged, it would likely be upheld. And so we think San Diego, California is probably one of the best models for doing this.
Yeah, we helped draft a policy in West Virginia as well, and the FAA has said it's one of the best policies that they've worked with, and we worked with the FAA on that, and that's kind of the key. And one of the things you can't do, you can't just copy and paste somebody else's ordinance. You really can't, because you might have a state park, you might have taller buildings, you might have shorter buildings, everybody has something different. So don't think that you can just go and cut and paste, because what you don't know is if eventually you're going to be the fifth city down the line, and you don't know how many things have been changed since the San Diego ordinance, and what's changed. So just be aware if you're trying to copy and paste from somebody else's ordinance. Not a great idea.
So we don't have time to get in all this, but in addition to what we've talked about, regulating the guy who's too close to the water tower, there's all sorts of other stuff out there that you may need to be concerned with. Privacy is a really big one. Search and seizure, Fourth Amendment law. A lot of uncertainty here. There's not any case law. The NTIA, which we're usually more familiar with in a broadband capacity, has put out some guidance, some best practices on privacy. A lot of uncertainty here. Another thing I tell a lot of my clients that when they say, and we need to create a comprehensive drone law to prevent this guy from doing illegal drone racing or something like that. What laws do you already have on the books? Nuisance, trespass, peeping Tom, voyeurism, all that stuff is applicable to drones. Just because you're doing it with a drone and not a camera, there's no distinction in the law. And in fact, there's been successful applications of these type of common law type powers to drones. And there's this really hilarious case, Boggs versus Meredith, where a guy who was calling himself the drone killer claimed to stand his ground and shoot down his neighbor's drone with a chain gun. I'm not even kidding. It's a hilarious case. That case was decided solely under state law, no FAA consideration at all. So it is viable options to use those existing laws you have on the books against drones if someone's being a bad actor.
And once again, this is how you pay for your own program. I'll help you. No. So some state legislative trends. As you can see, back in 2013, a lot has happened in the last 4 years with this. And they're really trying to come to grips, because what happens is new laws keep coming out, new congressional mandates keep coming out. And so one of the things that happens is once you pass some of this, you need to make sure that you are moving forward and staying on top of it all the time.
So just as the state houses across the country are on top of this topic, so is the federal government. And what's really interesting is a lot of these pushes are bipartisan. Every single one of these bills I'm going to show you has people on both sides of the House that are supporting this. The first one I'm going to talk about is the Drone Federalism Act. This one was sponsored by Cory Booker out of New Jersey. And something it does that's really interesting is it preserves local authority under 200 feet to regulate. This is something the National League of Cities has a U.S. Conference of Mayors have all got behind, still in committee, but as we're going to see later, that may change. Keep going. A couple other laws very similar in nature. One is the Safe Drone Act. It's going to overturn that Taylor case we talked about that Chrissy kind of alluded to, where it's going to create registration requirements and law, not regulation, for hobbyists. But also does all sorts of stuff to get drone law ticking again, get the FAA off their butts and start passing some of these regulations they promised to do. Drone Innovation Act, very similar to the Drone Federalism Act. You kind of see some of the stuff it does there to preserve local authority. But the reason why all these three laws are important is the next slide. And that's the FAA reauthorization bill. It's up right now. And it was funny, as I was flying out here, I was reading on Politico that this is a must-pass bill, the FAA Reauthorization Act. It's the next big fight in Congress. It has to pass because the FAA's funding expires at the end of the month. And people are loading it up with drone stuff, as you might imagine. So a lot of those pieces, those other legislation you saw, are getting picked up and put into the two competing FAA Reauthorizations Acts, one in the Senate, one in the House. they're pretty similar, but they're going to have a big effect no matter which one passes, how they get chopped up and Christmas treed on the current drone world. Both these include studies on preemption. They're going to change the public COA rules. These are must pass, as I said. Keep an eye out on what happens here. Another thing too, if you see my past presentations, I've talked about the Drone Advisory Committee. It was kind of hailed. It's kind of like the BDAC, if you guys are familiar in the broadband world. Hailed as we're going to create, we're going to finally settle this preemption thing in addition to a whole bunch of other stuff. And we're going to come up with model codes for everybody. And we're going to load this commission up with industry representatives and have 2 local governments on there, San Francisco and Kansas County, it looks like. And what's funny is, they started off with a lot of steam behind them. We're going to figure out this preemption issue. And I just read the minutes last week of the latest meeting. They basically have given up at this point and said it's too hard. And they've decided that there's not enough local government participation in our meetings. That was a really dumb idea. We should have had them more involved. And so this is kind of an interesting turn of events. They're going to have another meeting where they may make a recommendation, but we'll see.
So we have some best practices that we're going to talk about here. So recommended operations.
Operations, as we talked about, a lot of legal concerns there. You really need to concern whether you're going to own and operate your own UAS, whether you're going to lease it, whether you're going to hire a third party to do it. And this is all really important mostly for insurance purposes and for liability purposes. A lot of you guys probably have risk pooling that your city is in, and that you're part of a state organization that covers insurance needs for your city. At least in Colorado, we know of, as we've talked to our insurance pool about it, they do not cover drones. They said, we will not cover drones. We don't think they're a core part of government. You have to get private insurance out there, and your insurance requirements are going to vary based on whether you own it, whether someone else owns it, whether they have their own policy. You need to go out there and check out insurance for sure. Also important to note that you are liable for the acts of your contractor potentially. If your contractor is not authorized, they do a Skypan, get you a $1.6 million fine. The city is also potentially on the hook. And there's FAA case law that backs that up. So really important to do that.
So one of the things that we've worked on, like I said with Dubuque, is developing internal policies regarding safety, data retention, use of video, and PIC programming. And one of these things, like this data retention chain of custody, cities already have that for their police departments. You already have this on the book, so we're not creating anything new. We're just going to make sure that it points to those current regulations.
Another interesting one I have on here is mutual aid provisions. A lot of your cities have an agreement with the next city or next county over that you're going to share resources in the event of a natural disaster. What happens to that drone? If I'm Denver and Aurora asks for my drone as part of a mutual aid provision, and Aurora's not certified, that could be a potential issue. So you got to work out those issues as well.
We're going 2 minutes over, Rich. Yeah. That's all. So recommendations for operations. If hiring services of a third-party provider, ensure they have the necessary FAA exemptions. We talked about this before. Make sure they're insured. Make sure that they know what they're doing. Make sure that if you're hiring somebody to do videography, that they're not somebody who goes out and just does data collection, right? I mean, they're very different skill sets. And make sure that they have a policy. It's kind of standard right now to have about a $1 million policy. It costs them like $800 a month. It's not. A year.
I was talking to Pierce County. I was talking to Pierce County, and they said $1,700 a year policy for their drone. How much do they pay for a $1 million policy, I think? And Dave, you can correct me if I'm wrong.
That's right.
Okay.
$1,700 to $1,800 a year for a $1 million policy.
Yeah, so that's not that bad, guys, for considering $1.6 million fine could be out there. If you're gonna fly a drone, you're gonna put the money, get insurance, for sure. As your local insurance is not gonna cover it. As we've emphasized all along, please get flight training. Please go out and have a proper expert train you on how to operate your drone. Get it registered. Don't cut corners.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So recommended for regulators. So like we said before, consult with the FAA. That's so important. So coming out of the FAA's office, I used to work in the unmanned aircraft office for the FAA. And so, I helped write these regulations from the get-go and help write the roadmap and help write these Part 107 regulations. And so what's nice is to be able to go and talk to the people who actually wrote the regulations to understand what their intent was. So sometimes the FAA, they write these regulations and you're not really sure what the intent of that regulation is. And we always talk about the intent, right? And so to be able to connect cities with the personnel who actually wrote the regulations to understand the intent when you're drafting your own ordinances really helps out a lot. And then you can also understand maybe where they want to move forward, so that you can write an ordinance that will carry you for 3 years, not carry you for 3 months.
And the FAA has been really good about talking to people. We can get you contact information for your local FSDO to talk to the right person to do that.
Yeah. So why regulate? When you have something that's going to be $127 billion industry, you'd know that you have people in your city who are taking notice of this, and now all of a sudden drones are going to be their new livelihood. It's their bread and butter. It's how they're going to put food on the table for their families, right? And so right now, because it's a nascent industry, it's new. We're talking about that those 1.6 million people. This is why you have to regulate, because when you're looking at something that has this much financial backing behind it, people are taking notice, and they're quitting their jobs, and they're buying $1,200 toy drones, and they're starting companies and businesses with them, and they don't know what they're doing. And so until you guys regulate and make sure that you have good ordinances on the books to protect your city, that's why this is so important. And so recommendations for the regulators. So this is really cool. We have another really cool case study. So St. Mary's County, Maryland, what they decided to do was they were kind of having some problems. They became part of one of the test sites, and they wanted to make sure that the people in their county weren't afraid of drones. So they are putting on a drone weekend. They're doing FPV racing. They have local manufacturers coming in. They have a bunch of people coming in. They're doing an entire weekend out of it, introducing it to the STEM, K through 12 and colleges, local manufacturers. And this is how they're getting their city and their county involved, is they're putting on a big drone weekend. And we're helping them do this with FPV racing and making sure that the companies that they have on site are valuable and are going to put out the right message. And it's really important, and they're planning on doing this every year. And so that's how you introduce, if you're going to have your first responders, or you're going to have a drone flying over the city and you don't want people to be all freaked out about privacy concerns, introduce them to the drone and to the people, and then it gives them a warm fuzzy, and you're less likely to have all those calls to your first responders and your law enforcement about somebody peeking in on them. And then lead by example. So during the Power Partners and Jersey Access Group recently, we did a 2-day training session is what we did. And we talked about the rules, regulations, aviation, and how many people did we have? 12? 10? So we had 12 people in that class. Cities, municipalities, PEG personnel, videographers. We had them in there and we talked about 107. We got them prepped for their test. We did some hands-on. And so that's what we're talking about. You have to lead by example, like Rich did. He said, hey, before we have this conference, people are already here. Let's go ahead and do some Part 107 training. Let's tag this onto our conference. And so it worked really well. One city had their fire chief, their emergency city manager, and others. And once those people know how to and once you understand drones, then you can better write your ordinances. If you understand it, then you can write the ordinance. If you don't understand it, writing that ordinance is going to be really hard.
And that's it. So take it over, Rich.
Okay, so
5 minutes over.
as I said, there's a lot to it. There's become a lot more to it. A lot of things we thought we could do are now different. Please step up, because I'm sure there are a few questions in the room. And
See? Until the end.
Good morning. Let me first say I thought that was an incredibly informative, well-organized presentation. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Maybe Seattle is not the best place to ask this question, but I will, and I'm not sure it's actually true. But I have
Cannot carry marijuana on your drones.
I've heard that Amazon is contemplating having base stations on utility poles. And of course, at NATOA here, we have to bring everything back to the local rights of way, right? I wanted to know if you've heard that. Is it true?
Yeah.
And if so, have you thought about how that would fit into local regulation, especially when it comes to the public rights of way?
So they definitely have been talking about that, but I would say this is a ways off before they can even be able to put landing pads on utility poles. They don't even have authorization yet to fly property, and so we have a long way to go before we get there. And also, I mean, our electric utility in Colorado won't even let us put small cells on their poles. So I can't imagine them saying we're going to put landing pads on utility poles. So it's definitely an interesting issue to consider, but we still haven't even figured out how to put carriage on a drone yet. And all those bills I showed you earlier that's in the federal level right now, all of them are trying to force the DOT, to force the FAA to kind of put it in different camps to come out with rules about how they can do carriage of property for the Amazons of the world that want to deliver stuff by drone. It's certainly an interesting issue, not one I've ever been asked before, so I appreciate the question. But through my own experience on this, I think it's a long ways off.
Yeah. And so there are a lot of pushes out there. So NASA, it's the Unmanned Aircraft Traffic Management System, and actually ICAO, which is the International Civil Aviation Organization, international laws for aviation, right? You take off from Seattle and you fly to Hong Kong, right? You got to make sure that your aircraft and your pilots and everybody are talking the same talk, and everybody's certified, and you have airworthiness and stuff. So same type of so that organization that kind of covers all of that, they actually are meeting today on that kind of topic, and it's called the Unmanned Aircraft Traffic Management, UTM. NASA, a gentleman by the name of PK, he's amazing. If you follow him, he's super brilliant, and they're trying to figure out how do we regulate this 400-foot, 200-foot and below airspace with as many drones as we think are actually going to be happening with Amazon. And when you look at those numbers for Amazon, how many packages get delivered that are under that magical number? It's like 5 pounds. I think the numbers would just blow you away as to how many packages under 5 pounds get delivered every day by Amazon. And that's that sweet spot. And so you were talking hundreds of thousands of drones in the sky at any given time, and they're really struggling with that. They're coming together with it, but it's going to be a while.
There has been tests of this already. Virginia Tech has been big in this, trying to learn how we can do these package deliveries. But right now, the way they're doing it is it has to be within visual line of sight of the pilot. So a pilot is sitting at one place, and they've done this with Chipotle. I think Amazon and Chipotle have teamed up. The pilot has to watch the drone fly to Chipotle, pick up the burrito from a landing pad on Chipotle, go to it's crazy. Then he watches the drone come back to a park, which is like a couple blocks over, drops off on a landing pad on the park. He has to be watching the drone at all times, and here's the kicker: it can never go over a person. So they have to make sure that it.
Yeah.
So those are the kind of the constraints we're operating under right now.
And then you find out that they put cheese on it, and you ask for no cheese, and you
it
got to
back,
send it back.
Yeah. So we're a long ways off, but it's certainly coming.
Yes, sir.
Christina, especially for you, since you like to drive helicopters, local noise regulations.
Yeah, have you ever had a helicopter fly over your house before?
But it's interesting because the
yeah.
noise levels are different, the frequency is different.
Yeah.
Yep.
Love to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, so one of the things about the frequency being different, which I love, is when we talk about one of the big things that we're pushing as well is counter UAS, right? So what I do like about it is the frequency is different, so we can isolate that as far as counter UAS, especially for cities who have airports in their vicinity. That's a big deal, is counter UAS around airports right now. So I want to give a positive to the frequency. Recently, DJI came out with their Mavic. I don't know what they came out, the Mavic Pro, right? And one of the things that they're touting about that is the noise reduction. So they are noisy. So I'm fortunate I live in Arlington, Virginia. I'm in this 30-mile, 10, 15, 30-mile radius, just this huge no-fly zone for drones, right? So I never see them. I can't fly one in my backyard. And I came out to California recently, and I swear to God, I swear to you, every 2 hours somebody was flying a drone. I was doing an Ironman, my husband was doing an Ironman event, and a drone, literally, there were 3,000 people in a corral, and a drone flew over top of us so close I could have reached up and grabbed it. And Ironman was like, well, there's nothing we can do about it. We're not law enforcement. And law enforcement is like, well, I didn't actually see it, so there's nothing I can do about it. And that's a problem. That's a huge problem. And here you have somebody who's trained 7 years of their life to do something, to have a drone fall out of the sky right before they enter the water. So we have all these problems, but I know, go back to noise. So they're trying to come out with quieter drones. They're trying to figure it out, but
And so I can pick up
have
from
no-
there.
yeah.
Is I do have a little bit of familiarity with this topic, and the manufacturers are making drones quieter. They recognize there's a problem, but there's a long list of case law on the ability of cities to create, basically quiet zones for airports. All that stuff still applies. There's a series of Denver cases. Steve, you're probably familiar with them, where Denver has a very sophisticated noise program around the international airport there. Series of legal battles between the airlines and the city and county of Denver. Denver ended up winning most of that. So there is some power there. It's a gray area. It's never been applied to drones. And actually the first one's brought up noise as part of this. But generally your noise ordinances are part of that area of law. They're generally applicable police powers and are probably, it doesn't have to deal with the operations of the aircraft. It's noise. And so it probably is something you can still apply to a drone. But there is case law on this, something we're going to have to look at a little more in detail. But it's an interesting thought. It's something I haven't thought of before.
Yeah. So what I was going to say is in California, every 3 hours I heard a drone, and it ruined my experience. I was on the beach, ruined my experience. I did the skunk train. I don't know if anybody here is from California, but I rode the skunk train to the redwoods, and it totally ruined my experience. And so we're talking about ordinance. Yeah, that's great that they can fly, but you need to think about people who go to a park to be quiet and to have a picnic. I was really surprised. I was like, well, no wonder everybody's so up in arms about it. Everybody everywhere else is flying them all the time.
I'll ask you one.
That's it. Wow.
At the, back when you were in New Jersey, we were talking, we talked a lot about the fact that within one regulation, you can do what you're supposed to do, but get yourself in trouble in the process. And I thought it was interesting because we were talking about you have to 400 feet, but you have a mountain, and the mountain's 1,000 feet. So that means I can go 1,400 feet on that mountain. That mountain has an antenna. That antenna is 500 feet.
And you can go 200.
Now,
250. It's
as long as I
50
stay 200 feet away, I can go up to the height of that antenna plus 400. But if a plane flies over and sees me,
Yeah.
all bets are off.
Right. And depending on the airspace you're in, you could even be able to fly up that antenna anyways. And so it's one of the things you're going to learn when you take the 107 test is like the different layers of airspace and where you can and cannot fly. And I didn't have it on this particular presentation, but there's this there's the wedding cake principle of airspace. It can get very, very complicated. And if something that's well intentioned, you think you're staying within the rules, you're actually violating federal provisions, several federal provisions by doing so.
So I don't know if she's in here. A lady from Boston. I talked to her yesterday. She's not in here. So they're trying to figure out what to do, and she'd been working on it for a little while. And one of the things that we have is we have all of the airspace. I have it on my computer, so I can pull up your city, I can pull up your airspace, and I can tell you exactly within 5 minutes what you need to do, what waivers you need. And she was like, oh my gosh, I've been searching this for weeks. And so one of the reasons why bringing somebody on board who understands this is it's going to cut down your time. You're going to go down that rabbit hole for 6 months. You're going to go down that rabbit hole for a year, and you're going to just be overwhelmed. When you bring people on board who actually know what's going on, or you reach out to your local FSDO, or you reach out to somebody who actually knows what's going on, you're going to cut that time down, and you'll be up and running in a couple of weeks. And that's the difference. So don't think that you're going to be going down this rabbit hole for years. Just bring somebody on. And the other thing I want to say, we were talking about this yesterday. In manned aviation, we have a pilot. We have somebody who maybe operates our camera. We have our crew chief. We have our avionics guy. We have our operations personnel. We have all of these people who do all of these individual tasks. Because in aviation, you can get task saturated really quickly. In unmanned aviation, we expect all of that to be one person. We expect somebody to fly a drone and to operate a camera and to clear their airspace at the same time while they're looking down at their camera at the picture to get the picture, to fly the drone, to clear the airspace, to be our videographer that Peg is that we're hiring these people out to do. And so don't put this all on one person. If you go out, if you're doing cinematography, my cinematography teams, there's 3 of them. There's your pilot, there's your camera operator, and there's your visual observer clearing the airspace and clearing people around. This isn't a one-person operation, all right? And we need to get ourselves away from that mentality that this is just a one-person operation. Somebody's flying a drone, operating the camera, and clearing the airspace at the same time, because you're not setting that person up for success. And so don't try to do this on the cheap, because you can get one person for $500 a day who says that they can do all 3 of these things at once. It's not fair to them, and it's not fair to the community to set that as our standard. So think about that when you're developing your program. When you have your fire chief out there operating the drone, make sure that they have somebody there to help them out, to clear that airspace, to give them their situational awareness as well.
And with that, can we thank our panelists, please? And thank you all.
Okay.
Possibly.
Yeah. Do you have a card or something?
Is Natoa giving all the copies of slides? Does Natoa just send out copies of slides?
I believe so.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'll
we'll
send
just
you
go
a
from the
personal
top.
copy.
Okay.